You know, this is going to be an interesting one tonight. If you're debating at home whether marijuana ought to be legal, well, this will add to the fun. Man, it's an age-old conversation and an age-old product, and just about everybody's used it or knows people who use it, and it's not legal to have it on a pedestrian basis here in Rhode Island quite yet, but the momentum is coming. Welcome into My State of Mind. I am Dan York, and as we've been providing for you each and every Friday, a longer conversation without our usual rundown where we hit the issues of the day, because sometimes conversations need more breathing room. And tonight we have a debate of sorts, a couple of guys who've been debating the concept of marijuana status for quite some time, it seems. This op-ed piece got me to thinking, hey, Jess is the producer, as you know, we really ought to get these people in and talk about this thing. Rhode Island needs an honest pot debate. Well, let me raise the hand and say I'm raising my hand. I'll sponsor that. But most notably, headline here, a couple of nights ago, it was quite a debate on Smith Hill as new legislation has been introduced again to try to, clear the way for legalization. So that is the topic for tonight's discussion. On this side is Mike Cerullo, who's a licensed practitioner in the psychotherapy world. Mike, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
And
my pleasure.
Jared Moffitt is an advocate for the legalization of marijuana, and in a full-time capacity runs RegulateRI.com.
That's right.
Nice to have you.
Thank you.
Mike, you have an organization called What's the Rush?
That's correct. What's the Rush, Rhode Island?
Outline your short role in this debate and perspective, and then we'll lay out what the legislation calls for, and then we'll have a friendly Donnybrook about the whole situation. What's the Rush is what?
What's the Rush, Rhode Island is a volunteer grassroots movement. It's not incorporated. It's a group of individuals who are committed to three positions. The first is that Rhode Island does not have to make this decision now. We have the petri dishes of the Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska experiments from which we can learn. Everyone agrees marijuana is a toxic substance, especially to children, adolescents, and young adults. We should stop, look, and listen before Rhode Island makes the decision to legalize. Our second position is that in a detailed fiscal impact statement, including the regulatory, public safety, health care, and addiction treatment costs must be conducted and made available for public review and discourse. This has not happened in 5 years of this proposal being made. And third, if, and I emphasized if, the 113 members of the General Assembly and the governor decide to go ahead, then adequate, permanent, and guaranteed funding for prevention and treatment of addiction that will inevitably accompany widespread recreational use must be included in the legislation.
All right, off the script. By the way, you can talk to me. You don't have to.
Oh, I'm sorry,
work
sir.
The cameras. No, you're good. You're fine. You have a script?
Should I go into?
Tell everybody who you are and what you're doing here.
Right.
And then, I mean, Mike started to actually get into the arguments a little bit here as he introduces What's the Rush RI. But, hey, that's the premise of their organization. By the way, how many folks are involved in What's the Rush RI?
Well, I've got four co-conveners. Bob Hodeling, professor from an agronomy professor.
He wrote
from
the
URI.
op-ed piece that got my attention.
That's correct.
Yep.
That's correct. And then a retired pharmacist, Rick Maynard. We've got more than 100 people who have endorsed our positions, representing about 40 different communities in Rhode Island.
Very good, Jared. So this is your full-time job, correct?
That's correct.
Tell us about your organization.
Sure. So Regulate Rhode Island is a coalition of citizens, community leaders, and organizations from around the state who believe that our current policy of marijuana prohibition does far more harm than good, and would like to see that policy replaced with a more sensible system that regulates marijuana like alcohol.
Pretty simply said. Tell me about your organization. Is it little, big? How many folks are involved in it?
It's been growing since we started it in 2013. We now have over 25 organizations that are coalition partners, everyone from the Sierra Club to the NAACP, and we have members and volunteers across the state.
All right, so let me ask you a funky question before we actually even get into what the legislation calls for. Why are you involved in this?
Well, I'm personally involved because I believe the war on drugs, which we've waged in this country for now about 40 years, has done untold harm to families and communities across our country. And I believe that removing this marijuana prohibition and removing this policy that punishes adults and emphasizes the criminal justice system and replacing it with something that's more public health oriented would be of benefit for our communities and families.
Before we even continue with the legislation, I have to tell you, I'm impressed with him. Mike, you've been debating him for a while. I'm impressed with him because what I think you would predict, okay, you got the pro-marijuana guy. Hey, listen, you know, I have the right to do what I want to do in my own time. Is usually the premise for the pro-marijuana arguments, at least the ones that most people are familiar with. So he comes at this in a fairly sophisticated political way, don't you think?
Absolutely. He's a Brown undergrad with a PhD, not a PhD, but a degree in philosophy, as I recall.
Right.
They keep trying to promote me too. It doesn't work that way.
So I'm impressed with your approach.
Well, and just to clarify real quick, Dan, you know, we're not pro-marijuana. What we're saying is that the policy that we have right now has failed, so we're pro-regulation. There are folks in our coalition who can't stand marijuana, but they see that our current policy isn't working.
All right, now listen, you know, it's really none of my business, but everyone's going to want me to ask the question anyway. Are you a marijuana user?
I'm not currently. I have before. Like half of Americans have tried it at one point.
Okay, but it's not like your thing.
No, it's definitely not my thing,
Okay.
and the policy is my thing.
All right, well, that's fair. You know what, I'm going to pause right here. And when we come back, we're going to lay out what the legislation calls for, and then we're going to talk about why it's a good idea or not. So stay with us.
We are here today to support this legislation because it has implications that are more than just economic. But as a farmer and a plant science student at URI, I also recognize the incredible opportunities that will be created in terms of cannabis and hemp research at the university level. Due to the prohibition of marijuana, there's a tremendous lack of adequate research being conducted on the cultivation of the plant, its effects on the brain, and the risks and/or benefits of long-term use.
You know, it's not like a whippersnapper from URI to come in and say, hey, listen, so we can study it, you got to make it legal. You buy that argument?
I'm sure that one of my co-conveners, Dr. Rebecca Brown, this is probably one of her students. She's an agronomy professor.
So
at
the
URI.
professor would disagree with the students, what you're telling me?
I think that yes, she would.
Yes, all right. Jared, tell me about where we are and where you want to go with the legislation that is pending. Right now, we allow for medical marijuana in Rhode Island. Frankly, the way they put it together, I thought was a scam. We don't have to get into the details of that. Other than, you know, government setting up private profit opportunities is just kind of I don't have an argument with medical marijuana usage. I have an argument with, but that's a whole nother conversation. I started another show. All right, good night, everybody. We'll be right back. What's up with this legislation? What do you want to see happen?
Well, 57% of Rhode Islanders support regulating marijuana like alcohol, and that's exactly what this legislation would do.
Stop. Where does that come from? The public policy polling, this is information
Correct.
that you sent us. This is legitimate polling, you would suggest?
Yes. Public policy polling, they're based in North Carolina.
57% support. All right, well, that's an argument to buoy what you want. Rather than arguing for what you want, tell me what you want
Okay,
in the
so
legislation.
yeah, so we want to, again, regulate marijuana like alcohol, which means that we're going to have licensed retail stores that have to comply with regulations. They're going to be manufacturers that are licensed. They're going to be safety compliance centers, which are mandatory testing before it's actually sold to the consumer. It has to be tested and labeled. And we're going to allow adults to purchase up to 1 ounce of marijuana from these licensed stores if they're 21 or older.
And an ounce is how much? I mean, I know, duh, an ounce is an ounce. But an ounce is how much usage? It's back in the old days when you could buy a dime bag. This is going way back for the Dan York state of mind.
Yep.
I don't even know how much that was. How much was that?
Kevin Hill, who's a professor at Harvard, points out that you can get 80 joints in terms of our generations.
Out of
Look
an
at it.
ounce?
Out of an ounce.
Got it.
And
So
this
it's
is
like a-
high potency stuff compared to.
So you want us to be able to walk around with as many as 80 joints available to us?
Well, it's like being able to buy a handle of vodka or some type of liquor. And, you know, it's actually, compared to alcohol, this legislation is far more strict than the way that we regulate alcohol. So-
Because?
Well, because there's so much opposition to what we're doing, we want to show that this can be done in a safe, regulated way, and so we want to make sure that adults are, doing this responsibly. So we want to limit this to see, what happens when we do this, and we think that it's going to be done very responsibly and correctly.
All right. And so past an ounce, what are the penalties?
So there would continue to be potentially criminal penalties for anyone possessing over an ounce. And, so it wouldn't necessarily, that would be up to the judge's discretion to determine what to do, but it would be a misdemeanor.
How do you get the dope? This is I've never been able to figure this one out. Mike, do you understand? How do you get the medical marijuana thing? Until we created these dispensaries, we first legalized medical marijuana without the dispensaries.
Right.
Well, okay, so I gotta deal with a criminal in order to get this product that's okay for me to use.
So under the medical marijuana program, patients and caregivers are allowed to grow, they're allowed to get a license from the Department of Health, and that license entitles them to grow a certain number of
Where
plants.
are the folks who are selling the marijuana going to legally obtain it?
So they're going to grow it. They're going to be licensed producers, and they're going to be regulated, and so it's going to be
So it's
set
going to
up.
be homegrown product.
No, so they're going to be licensed stores. They're going to be licensed manufacturers.
I mean, homegrown to the store.
The store is going to grow it in probably a warehouse that's equipped with all the equipment that they need. There will be a provision for some home
So we're
grow as
building
well,
an
but small
industry.
amount.
It's what we're doing here, in a way.
We're building a new market. We're converting from an illicit industry and making it a regulated industry.
You
I
got
think
the
it's
floor.
important to note that this is homegrown as well. There are supposed to be
You can have a couple of plants.
You can have plants in your home, and they're supposed to be regulated. But Bob Hodling pointed this out. The way it's structured, it's like releasing the kraken on a kite string and thinking you'll be able to control its flight. That's how he feels about it right now. I couldn't agree more. Being able to regulate this is very, very, very challenging. Colorado's going crazy with it right now, trying to regulate it. They've had to hire 70 already FTEs to regulate the retail shops. They're looking for another 20
FTE means?
full-time equivalent employees. That would be
Bureaucracy.
bureaucracy. And the public safety people are already saying they need more money, more staff to manage the regulations that are there already. The increases in DUIs, driving under the influence of drugs, the increase in black market activity and gray market activity.
Now, why is that? You talk to each other about this.
Well, I'd love to see the evidence that the black market is increasing, because we've seen actually a decrease in the number of seizures at the U.S.-Mexico border, which is indicating there's been a huge hit to Mexican drug cartel profits. We've seen $700 million worth of sales within this legal regulated setting. That's $700 million that might have gone into the hands of criminal dealers.
Well, the reality is, the Washington Post just pointed out that the reason that we're not having any more marijuana interdictions at the border is they don't need to. They just grow it here in Colorado. We've cut the cost of transport. We've cut the cost of production. And instead, what the cartels are doing is shipping over more heroin and meth. So it's easier for them to get that into the country. And then what's happening, and we know this, and there's plenty of current data on this, we know that what's going on in Colorado is that they're shipping it from there to 40 different states right now based on current data. And those 40 states, what they're shipping there is much more concentrated. The packages are smaller. If they do it right, they can hide the concentrated honey oil, which has got a 90%
Let me ask you this.
concentration.
Let me ask you this. Now that I'm listening to you guys debate this, it's a provocative product that we're talking about, no doubt. But doesn't every industry have growing pains? when it starts, Mike. I mean, isn't there all sorts of things that we find out need to be fixed along the way when we build a new business?
Well, this is true, and that's one of the reasons that what's the Russia's position is we need to wait 5-6 years. Everybody thinks at least that before we understand what the impacts are of this experiment. Back in my marketing guy days, there was a guy named Ted Levitt who used to talk about a concept called imitative innovation. So here we are in Rhode Island talking about imitating what's going on in Colorado that's a brand new product. And one of the things he used to warn us all about was Make sure you learn about their hidden costs, unintended consequences, liabilities of scale before you imitate. Otherwise, you're going to be imitating their mistakes.
Well, you know, it
And-
just resonates with me that your organization is what's the rush. You're not saying absolutely not, right?
That's correct. At this point, we're saying, show us.
So why not have some patience?
Well, I don't think that's correct. I think that Mike tries to portray himself as saying, let's wait a little bit. But I don't think in 5 to 6 years Mike's going to be at the State House testifying in support of this if we don't pass it soon. I think that's the same argument that people have
Well,
used.
let me say, would there be something that would cause you to
I'm
say,
a
you
very
know what,
open-minded
okay.
man. My first op-ed, I had 4 op-eds in the paper last year. My first op-ed opened with the question, with the statement, I am opposed to this legislation unless, and these were the 3 conditions in that op-ed. So, I'm willing to be persuaded, but the people who are going to get persuaded are 113 legislators and the governor. They're the ones that are going to make the decision. I think our responsibility is well-informed citizens, and I'm certainly well-informed about the impacts on youth and addiction, have the
So-
responsibility to educate
So last
General
night at
Assembly.
the hearing that we had for the legislation, Mike described this bill as a train equipped with nuclear explosions coming into a city and the city representing our children. That's not language from someone who wants to have an even-handed debate.
Did you say that?
I said it's reminding me at the moment of Denzel Washington's Runaway movie, in which this train lost its brakes and governing system and started running, and nobody had an idea how to control it. That's no different than what Bob Hoadling is saying about the Kragan.
Yeah.
We don't know what's down the road yet, but we can know.
All right, but see, here's
We
what
can know.
you know, I wish we had hours. We only have a half-hour show. When we come back, I'm going to pose the question to my guests. It seems to me that it's not if, but when. Stay with us. All right, welcome back. This conversation between Mike and Jared, Mike is saying, what's the rush on marijuana? And Jared's saying, come on, man, let's get this legislation going. Let's do it the right way. I posed the question. It feels like there's an inevitability of legalization of marijuana in Rhode Island and maybe across America. I could emote about how I feel about that, but I'll hold off for a second. Do you agree?
I think that that's an unresolved question at this point. I think that there's already a turnaround in the polling in Colorado as to whether or
Oops.
not they support it. The polls, Gallup
Like
and
an
so
oops
forth,
factor?
That's not entirely true. There's a poll that just came out a few weeks ago that showed 62% support and only 37% opposed, which is different than when the bill passed in 2012, which was 55 to 45. So
and there's 4 other polls that have been recently conducted that say the opposite. And that data is contained in a April 15th report.
Well, it seems to me
from
that
Colorado.
if we
dueling
move,
polls can work. For example, the Rhode Island poll, showed that the population segment that's the largest in Rhode Island is only supporting this in the 40 to 45% range. And that's people who vote 65 and older, as you well know. So I think that it's a little disingenuous to talk about polls that show an increase in support in Colorado when all the data that's coming out of there on very recent
all right,
studies
so
is saying the opposite.
got it. So I would think that polling data is a small part of the data that ought to be analyzed in deciding whether we ought
course.
to do this. Do you
Sure,
agree?
absolutely.
So battling about polls, you sound like 2 politicians that are running for office, and the people go, oh yeah, enough of the polls. Is it a when, not if? You're feeling that momentum?
It's certainly a win. I mean, you see the growing momentum happening, and I think that the win question is very important because we know states like Massachusetts, Vermont, and Maine are poised to do this in the next couple of years. There was a report that came out from the RAND Corporation earlier this year in January. It talked about what's called the first mover advantage. And what they're referring to is a competitive edge that Rhode Island or whichever state in New England goes first because you give a head start advantage to your entrepreneurs and you attract more businesses. Again, we talked about the research opportunities for hemp around at URI and the eds and meds sector.
You think this is an economic tool, don't you?
I think that we don't need to wait because Rhode Islanders need jobs. We need to bolster our economy, and this is a simple way to do it.
All right.
Colorado has one of the fastest
You got to
growing
nurse.
economies.
You got to nurse me here. You're the shrink, and you can help me too. I hate this conversation. I mean, and I think a lot of people hate the conversation. Some people love the conversation, but there's a portion of people that I will tell you that personally, I will be let down if Rhode Island legalizes marijuana.
Why is
But
that?
I got to get on your couch for you to analyze me, because it just, to me, it just feels wrong.
Well, Dan, are you aware that Rhode Island never ratified the 18th Amendment, which created alcohol prohibition? So we rejected alcohol prohibition, and for the same reasons, we should reject marijuana prohibition. It's a failed policy.
Well, it's Friday night. I probably have a beer by this time, and I'll be thinking about that when I do.
Rhode Island was the first to declare independence and the last to sign the Constitution. We're not followers, we're leaders. And
Exactly.
I think we are beginning to become the leaders in the let's take a real look. Let's look under the hood conversation. You asked me a question before. I've got 9 grandchildren. I don't want to see them growing up in a cannabis culture. I personally would rather not see this happen. But again, I'm a realist.
Do you know what do you know what he means by cannabis culture? That's where my emoting comes from.
We don't have an alcohol culture. I mean, I don't see Mike saying that we should make alcohol illegal because there's some alcohol culture there. I mean, do you think that alcohol should be illegal?
We very much have. We have a.
I just don't think we should add another addictive material
We have
to
an
the
alcohol
culture.
There's no doubt about that.
We're not adding anything. It's already there. Anyone that wants to get
We
marijuana
would
gets
be
it. They just get it from a
we
criminal
would be adding
source.
an endorsement by the community. We would be giving, the state would be endorsing.
So is the state endorsing tobacco and alcohol right now?
No, but the state is
then-
finding that the primary way, and you heard this at the Brown Conference Tuesday, the primary way that prevention has been working in Rhode Island is to limit access.
Which prohibition is a
This
total
is the
failure at doing.
algorithm that works, and this is the algorithm that moves people toward more use and increased addiction. So I'm going to give these.
We only got a minute and a half, so you better go fast.
Because we've medicalized and decriminalized, everybody, in both kids and parents, believe that it can't be too bad because it's medicalized, it's harmless. It's not a crime, so it's no big deal. The parents are believing some of this. The kids absolutely believe it. They're getting all their marijuana from medical sources, diverted medical marijuana.
Well, I'll say the same
and
thing
that
that
access.
Okay, good. React.
Yeah,
to that.
Representative Agello responded to this point by saying that there's all sorts of things that are medical that we don't think are necessarily good. Opiate prescription painkillers are one example, aspirin's another. You can die from taking too much of those things. Just because we treat it as a medical thing doesn't mean that we have a full stamp endorsement on it.
And they are also highly regulated by people like the FDA.
Yeah, people are croaking all over the place from
And
opiate overdoses.
There's no question.
You know,
And
Mike, I got to
Okay.
run the show. Promise to come back. okay?
Absolutely.
Promise to come
Absolutely.
back because time is short. Let's do some stuff on the radio as well in short order to be able to talk this out more. But I appreciate both of your advocacies, and I have to say, in summary, I'm impressed by both arguments. It's a jump ball for me. You'll have to determine if it's a jump ball for you. Legislation is pending. Talk to your reps. One more thing, and we come back. Stay with us. I can promise you there's not too many issues that compete with this when it comes to your feedback. Your state of mind is important to us. Give us a ring, leave us a voicemail, 228-1886, stateofmind@myritv.com is the email, tweet or Facebook post. Don't forget the E or it won't come through. There's no doubt that we've got to follow up on this medical marijuana conversation. There does seem to feel like there's inevitability to it. Some of us aren't very comfortable with that, but it might be a brand new time in history. I don't know. Thanks for watching.